What's up, everybody? This is Brian Davidson, and you are listening to the NIL Spotlight podcast brought to you by NIL Game Plan, your number one source for NIL news and, more importantly, education across all collegiate sports. Let's get after it. Today on NIL Spotlight, I'm joined by Michael Flores, former offensive lineman at Dartmouth, Old Dominion, and Louisville, and now one of the founders of Triad Sports. Michael's story is the perfect snapshot of where college athletics is right now. He lived the transfer portal from the inside. He saw agents promising big numbers, charging big commissions, and sometimes putting their own incentives ahead of the athlete's best fit. So Michael and his brothers decided to do something about it, an NIL agency for the modern college athlete. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Michael, let's rewind before NIL even became a thing. Let's go back to your recruiting process. And specifically, I want to talk about the recruiting process where you ended up in the Ivy League, because it could be a little bit different. Also, rewind to you're in high school and you're starting to go through this recruiting process, starting from college coaches. What was that like?
Absolutely. So my story starts, with my older brothers who all went Ivy League as well. Our oldest brother, Jacob, ended up going to Dartmouth and was recruited by them back in 2011. So we got to see the beginning of the Ivy League process. Our mom was very big on academics first. She had a rule that you had to have a 95 or above, or else it wasn't good enough. So from a young age, always prioritized academics over everything. And so through my brother's recruitment process, Jacob goes to Dartmouth, Charlie goes to Columbia, and then my other brother, John Paul, goes to Dartmouth. We got to experience just how you could use academics to leverage, your athletics, but also the opposite is that we used our athletics to leverage and advance our academics as well. So we saw that dynamic and, decided that the best option was to go Ivy League. When we were getting recruited, when the coaches had a pitch, he said, I can't put 80,000 in the stands, but I can put 80,000 in your pocket as soon as you graduate from Dartmouth. And so from that point on, my family was sold on that element. So being from that lineage, I knew that Dartmouth was always a possibility if I kept my grades up and worked very hard. So that was kind of our access into the Ivy League and why we ended up choosing that route.
And one of the big myths about the Ivy League is while there's no scholarships available, there's quite a bit of financial aid. How do you tap into that process?
Absolutely. That's one of the things that we would tell parents and other kids who are looking to do the same is to get educated on that process. There is a threshold where if your parents don't make a certain income, then you essentially go for free. You only pay a few $1,000s a year to go and get an Ivy League education. And so we took advantage of that route and, explored that process, what the financial aid looks like, because, doing your research is a big thing. A parent initially hearing no athletic scholarships, that might be a big turnoff, but the Ivy Leagues have been able to leverage that and work around that in order to still take care of those athletes who wouldn't have an opportunity to go to their school. They found different avenues and routes for them.
So Michael, you weren't at Dartmouth too long before you ended up at ODU. Talk about your initial experience and your first decision to transfer.
Yeah, so I got to tell the story of sort of how it all began. When I first got into college in 2019 was the first year of the transfer portal. Now my brother, who was at Columbia, Charlie, he'd gotten injured his fifth year, and so he was going to be eligible for his sixth year. And he was the third person ever in the transfer portal and transferred to SMU. So as soon as I stepped on campus at Dartmouth, I was already thinking about the eligibility and what this means if I sit out, what are the current rules. So throughout my time at Dartmouth, I was kind of always thinking ahead because my story was I didn't play my freshman year. I got hurt before I stepped onto college campus. So I sat out my freshman year with a back injury. And, it was very tough seeing my teammates out there. But in the back of my head, I was like, I'm going to get this year back on the end of it with how the rules are set up. And so going through that process, Charlie had showed that transfer was possible. Get your degree, play your years, prove that you can play at a high level, and then, move on to another school. But it was at this time that before NIL that we were thinking of it in terms of going somewhere to get a master's paid for. So looking at it through the lens of using athletics to advance your academics during this time. So it all changes when my brother John Paul, who's a year ahead of me, graduated in 2022. He decides to transfer from Dartmouth. He has extra eligibility from a red shirt, and then the COVID year in 2020, he decides to transfer from Dartmouth to UVA. And so this is when we first started hearing of potential NIL. He's getting numbers thrown at him. And so my turn comes around in 2022, late 22 after my season, early 23. And I was exploring some options, a couple schools down here in Texas, but Old Dominion did a great job at keeping up with me in the recruiting process. Their coaches did a great job of making me feel loved, sending me a text message, writing me a letter. They did the best at staying in touch and in communication, because every coach has their different style of how they communicate or show interest, but these guys really had it dialed down. And one thing that was interesting was Old Dominion had the youngest staff in all of FBS at the time. So I think being able to, connect with those younger players, they sort of had an advantage over others. So that's how I ended up there after my time at Dartmouth.
And Michael, when was the first time you heard the words NIL and thought this might apply to me?
I think the first time I'd heard of NIL was probably around after COVID, and hearing some of the stories of the Dartmouth seniors who had extra eligibility and were going to go on to other schools, and kind of hearing some of those stories about extra eligibility, incentives, and NIL. I would say it was around that time. One of the other shifts that I think accelerated the NIL talks as well was, I remember during my period at Dartmouth that there was initially, the when I got there freshman year, you could only transfer if you graduated. Well,
Right.
during my time at Dartmouth, that changed, and I couldn't tell you exactly when. You could look it up, but it changed from you can only graduate if you graduated to you can transfer whenever. And so, and from my point of view, the talks of NIL really sped up when it essentially becomes free agency, when you don't have to graduate, when a student athlete doesn't have to. I think during that time, it was the quickest route of go 3 years, get a degree, then you can leave. Well, throughout this whole process, there's rules that change every week, every month, every year. And so NIL, first hearing about it came during that time of, wow, kids can just leave whenever. And then what's the downstream effect of that? It's the NIL, the incentives.
And speaking of incentives, were you thinking about it from a brand endorsement perspective, lending out your name, image, and likeness, or were you thinking it a little bit more on the pay to play side?
Yes. I think I was thinking of it more, I didn't really think about my brand too much when I was
Okay.
in college. And I made that mistake of not leaning into that. That we'd have a couple of teammates that would take advantage and reach out to sponsors, and would reach out to other companies, partner, get free hats, free gear, promote a product. That was going on at Dartmouth, but I think it was more so pay to
Okay.
play as in my long term hopes and dreams was eventually to get paid somewhere, whether that be in a professional setting or, as more talks were going on, hey, it might not be that far in the future now with NIL talks in college, getting paid that way. So I would say definitely not the brand, which I wish going back to doing it again, I would have leaned into harder.
Well, you mentioned free agency a second ago. So with free agency came the rise of the agents. When did you first hear from an agent, Michael?
When I first heard from an agent was my senior year at Old Dominion. This was December of 2024. I got a DM from an Instagram agent who told me that he could get me $500,000 to $750,000 if I entered my name in the transfer portal. And, coming from my background, I couldn't pass up entertaining the idea of that possibility. Well, one thing leads to another. I didn't sign with this guy, but he ended up putting my name out there and talks with the coaching circles, and Old Dominion found out. Well, a couple of days later, I'm in the portal, and it's at this moment that my inbox on Twitter is being filled by other agents who are charging high rates of 15 to 20%. And I'd heard, from my other teammates who were signing and hopping in the portal at Old Dominion that they were signing these crazy rates of 20. But luckily I had counsel from my oldest brother, Jacob, who played in the NFL, told me this is outrageous. The NFL only charges 3%, and we have agents out here taking 20 plus percent. So he starts advising me the portal cycle is getting late and not many spots are left available. So I end up going with one of the bigger name agencies who had some of the bigger centers in the class, and they sort of promised the same amount that they could get me like 6 figures. Well, they made 2 to 3 phone calls on my behalf, and I was not happy. I'm unpleased. I'm not getting any big time offers. And my older brothers come in and help and say, we got to do this ourselves. They start advising me to reach out to coaches on my own instead of going through an agent. And it was through these means that we ended up getting an offer to Louisville when I reached out to my brother's former O-line coach there at Louisville, and he let me know that they had a spot. So we realized at this time that, it's really about those connections in order to make a difference for a kid's life. These are important decisions. These are life-changing decisions of finances and college and the trajectory that the rest of your life will go. And it just seemed that the agents were only out to, self benefits.
And when did you make the decision with your brothers to start Triad? Was it during your final season in college that you already knew you're going to go this route? Or was it after you graduated, or after going through that experience, you said, I don't want anything to do with this? Or you wanted to lean in and say, I can help?
Yeah, the initial talks for Triad started during that process that I went through in early 25. And my brother just said, hey, we need to do something to help kids who are in the same boat. Oldest brother started training and doing private lessons for kids here in Dallas-Fort Worth. He started 8 years ago, and now it's my family's business called Trench University, where we give private lessons, coaching to offensive and defensive linemen in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So he started this company, and through that process was advising other kids and including his brothers as well. So the initial talk started with sort of that aspect of helping out the kids. And there's got to be a better way than giving up 20% of what you've worked for your entire life. So the initial talks for Triad started then. And I think throughout my final season this past year at Louisville, we really saw hey, this could be a real thing that we leaned into. And so the day after my final game, we played Toledo this past year in the Boca Raton Bowl down in Florida. And after that game was done, we got the bowl win. We decided, okay, let's go all in and see what we can make of this.
That's amazing. And I know you guys anchor your commissions around 3%, which makes sense. But do you still see other agents and agencies charging more than that?
Yes. Yeah, we see it all the time. It varies. And there's also a separation that I think that parents and other players should be aware. So there's the commission on the NIL, the revenue sharing, the actual contract that kids are getting. And then there's the commission on any brand deals or anything else. So the story that I think best tells it all is that these agents started out as marketing agents getting brand deals for athletes. And in the NFL, if you get a deal for a player, well, they don't take 3%, they take more, they take 15 to 20%. And so that's how these agents started off taking these large amounts because it made sense. Like, hey, I'm actually bringing you a deal and earning it. Well, that those deals were not as big as the actual contracts that kids are getting in
Sure.
revenue sharing now. And so for them, it was an easy sell of, if some of these people aren't educated in the space, and that's what you guys are doing here at NIL Game Plan is providing them that education to make the most informed decision. So they started just charging the same amount for the contracts, which have gotten outrageous. Taking 15 to 20% of, when I was at Louisville, I got teammates that are making hundreds of thousands of dollars, a couple that have multi-million dollar contracts. That's different than bringing a kid, $1,500, $2,000 deal from a law firm or something.
Today's episode is sponsored by NIL Game Plan. NIL Game Plan helps student athletes and their families navigate the world of NIL with confidence. From building a personal brand and creating content to understanding financial opportunities and planning for the future, NIL Game Plan provides practical tools and guidance every step of the way. What sets NIL Game Plan apart is that it's designed specifically for middle school, high school, and college student athletes, making NIL education accessible, simple, and actionable no matter where they are in their journey. So whether you're just getting started or already growing your brand, NIL Game Plan helps you take control and protect your future. And the best part, you can get started for free today at nilgameplan.com. Big thanks to NIL Game Plan for sponsoring today's episode.
Okay. And in your work now, what sort of mistakes do you see student athletes and families still making even in this age?
Yeah. I would definitely say that it has to do with the trust factor, with feeling trust and building that trust with the parents and the players as well. I would say that just make an informed decision to do research because I know how stressful that those situations get. These student athletes are dealing with so much. They're dealing with school, they're dealing with their athletic career, finances, stage of life, worrying about the future. And so, I'll harp again on making sure that when it comes to a life-changing decision that you're making an informed decision, whatever that may be. And, there are a lot of good agents out there doing the right thing. It's just in the space now with no rules or regulation. It's tough when anybody can be an agent or say that they're an agent helping out kids and there's really nothing to back it up. So I would say do your research. There's a lot of good resources out there like you guys are building. There's a lot of people that want to help. But as the money in the NIL grows, the more people are going to get involved that have their self-interests and they're going to prioritize that.
Back when I worked in recruiting, Michael, I used to always tell student athletes and families, you cannot rely on your high school coach to do it all for you. You can't rely on just even a college camp to all of a sudden be discovered. You have to get involved in this process. In your NIL and your transfer process, you found that relying on an agent wasn't good enough. Even for the student athletes that you represent today, how do you advise those athletes to stay involved in the process to take their future into their own hands?
Absolutely. That's completely correct. We advise them on kind of the routes to go down, how to get recognized, how to get on a staff radar initially is sort of the big thing. I would say for high school athletes and then for college and transfer athletes are kind of different. For high school, we advise getting to those points and creating those relationships with coaches because you can't get recruited until you get on some sort of radar, a coach's board, all the stuff like that. So we have different steps that we'll execute with them and advise them on in order to just get on somebody's radar, which is what happened for our oldest brother when he got recruited by Dartmouth. He got flagged in some recruiting system, and that's initially how the relationship started. And now 15 years later, it's produced all this. So it's a domino effect of getting on the radar, doing the right stuff. When it comes to transfer portal athletes and college athletes, we advise them as well on how to navigate the portal, the unknowns, the stress that there is, and how do you take advantage of the network that you already have. You know, the coaching world is so small that all these coaches know each other, or they either worked somewhere together, or coached or went to even college together. So, leaning back into doing your research into these coaches that you're reaching out to and finding any way to make that connection, and again, build that trust with the coach is so essential to do that.
I can remember the first time I went out to the AFCA and saw just how tight that fraternity of coaches were and just how small a world things were. So that makes a ton of sense with me. As far as, selecting an agent, I can't imagine the best way to select an agent is answering an Instagram DM. So how should an athlete go about finding an agent? How should they go about fielding incoming from agent? What should that process look like?
Yes, I think it's multivariate. I think one of the first things to do is to hop in, do the research, see how connected the agent is. First of all, obviously see results, see who they've worked with in the past, and not only who they've worked with in the past, but what level of athlete. My mistake when I chose the agency that I did was that I assumed that because they were working with top level athletes that they had done work to get them to schools that they wouldn't have been able to without them. And so seeing the layers of how much work, how much of a network are these agents actually tapping into, not just who they're working with. Have they actually been in the space a while in order to create those relationships? And it doesn't have to be, you played for 7 years or you have a family of connections, but finding somebody who has that reputation of, hey, there's no need to take advantage. The other thing we advise is to ask an agent, have you ever charged a kid over 3%? If so, why on their contract? And that's pretty telling of kind of where they're at and why we started this in the first place as well. So I
Well,
think there's
speaking of contracts, how many student athletes do you think really understand what's in that contract?
yeah. Ooh, it's not many. It's not many unless they've done their research or been a law student. We hear of horror stories every week about what was in somebody's contract. For example, I'll tell you that we're hearing stories of agents who are taking money, not through the rev share, not through brand deals, but they're taking money from kids' stipends, which is crazy. That's the bare minimum that kids are getting paid in order to.
I mean, that's for laundry, right?
Yes. Yeah. It's like for groceries, laundry, any other, the cost of living, the cost of attendance. So all that's factored into the stipend. And if you're signing a contract with an agent who has to take money, or it's even ever done that in the past, it's pretty disappointing to hear some of those stories that we've been told.
Well, our point of view is the best way to avoid those stories is to start early. Just how early should student athletes and families start thinking about the recruiting and the NIL process?
Yes, I think that as soon as you hit high school, you should start the conversations with recruiting, at least now towards the end. I would say there's two stages. I would say there's the recruiting process and the recruiting stage. And then there's when a kid gets to the NIL stage, and that could be at various different points. That could be if a kid is doing really good in high school and they've got a lot of offers, well, they're going to get offered NIL when they go on their visits their junior summer. It could be 3 to 4 years into their college career before they get to the NIL stage. So I think that there's a difference in the stages, but start thinking about that stuff early, about when I get to that NIL stage, what I'm going to do. And so I would say when you get into high school and you're in the recruiting stage, I would say that is the most important time to start thinking about it and creating a game plan like you guys help them with. And that could involve taking the first step, having a conversation with your high school coach. If your high school coach has hit his limit on how much he can help you, finding outside resources of people who give out education in this space, and then looking at other avenues of ways that I can game plan and be ready for whatever may happen. Because as I can tell you from the 7 years I was in it, the rules that I walked in day one are very different from the rules I walked in 7 years later.
Well, Michael, let's leave it here. If you did have to say this is the number one thing you need to have in your game plan as a student, athlete, and family going through this process, especially starting out high school, what is the number one thing you'd say to them?
I would say to find a good mentor. I mean, it could be various different avenues. That could be your position coach. It could be your head coach. It could be other avenues and other NIL companies online who are there to help, guide you in the area that you don't know, because it's very difficult if you don't know what you don't know. And there's so many other aspects to this. This is all, to me, icing on the cake. First, they got to deal with get their grades up. They have to worry about what kind of person they are, how they're performing on the field. And so this, while it is very important, is just, to me, the icing on the cake of once you've achieved and hit all those limits, then get somebody who is educated in this space in order to help and guide you. And so to have that long-term game plan, but at the end of the day, also be focusing on the things I got to do day in and day out to eventually get to the recruiting stage, eventually get to the NIL stage. So I think that that's the most important thing to focus on. And that if you want to play college sports, what we tell all the kids that we coach and train, there is a spot out there for you to do so. And so, it comes down to how much you want to put in is how much you get out at the end of the day.
That's awesome. Let's leave it there. Michael, where can we send people to find you on the web?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find our resources at triadnil.com, or you can email us at info@triadnil.com for any questions, any way that we can help guide you, point you in the right direction for resources. We will.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Michael.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks for listening to the NIL Spotlight podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to visit nilgameplan.com to get started on your NIL journey for free. We'll see you next week.